Welcome to No More Carbon Copies. It's the podcast for high-performing leaders with big goals who feel stuck trying to reach the next level. At Vivera Leadership, we believe no two leaders are the same. The best leaders perform at their highest when they understand what makes them unique and stop trying to lead like someone else. This is where we explore how to see ourselves clearly, address self-sabotage, and lead with clarity, confidence, and purpose. You don't need to be a copy, you just need to be you. Welcome to No More Carbon Copies.
Welcome to the No More Carbon Copies podcast. Excited today to have Christopher O'Reilly joining us today. And Christopher is a psychologist and has extensive experience in trauma and counseling centers. One thing I want to say about Christopher is he just, in the past year, has launched his own independent counseling center. Excited to hear more about that. Congratulations on that. And before we jump in, tell a little bit about your background, the things that kind of drive you to do the work that you do.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me, Roger. Yeah, so I trained and licensed as a clinician, as a therapist, and I have worked primarily in residential addiction and trauma treatment. I've worked at two very well-known, high-class treatment centers that, help different people for different reasons when it comes to addiction and trauma. Again, my training is clinical, but I would say I spent the bulk of my time in leadership, working as a therapist and then becoming a supervisor, director, and just finding myself more focused on, or should I just say also focused on the development of treatment programs, being part of the executive team to kind of help guide the treatment. So I really am passionate about leadership. I like working with leaders and, as a clinician. So that's a real big passion of mine.
Well, that's great because that's exactly what brought us to this conversation is your passion for leadership. So let's jump in. So today we are going to talk about narcissism. And this conversation comes from experiences both you and I have had in working with people, and both personally, but also working with clients who are talking about narcissism. And so real quick, as we jump into this, narcissism is a term that's used a lot. Mm-hmm. It's used to talk about my boss is a narcissist, or I work with narcissists, or whatever. And so I think it's important to kind of think about as we jump into this. There's a clinical side of it. There's like what it really is, but then there's also some of these dynamics that we talk about. So what's narcissism?
Yeah, and I like that you kind of shared what you just said, because I do think it's a term that's thrown around loosely. There's a whole spectrum, right? It's maybe a way to kind of describe someone that seems like they're pretty into themselves and they have a high sense of self-importance. But I mean, it is a mental health disorder that characterizes somebody who has a really strong sense of self-importance, but probably more importantly, it characterizes somebody who has a very difficult time kind of, being aware and interested in what is happening for other people around them. Someone that truly has a narcissistic personality disorder has a very difficult time being in a healthy relationship. And that could be personally or professionally. And when I say a healthy relationship, that tends to be a relationship that there's a give and take. There's a benefit for both. And it could be a whole host of reasons that someone gets to a point where that's very, very difficult for them to do, and, obviously there can be help and treatment for that. But yes, it is a broad spectrum, but it tends to characterize somebody that has, blinders on, so to speak, right? Somebody who has a hard time understanding the impact they have on others and maybe kind of sees things from their perspective and their perspective only.
That's interesting. I love the idea of that trouble being aware and trouble with the give and take in a relationship, a mutuality to relationship. So before we jump into the leadership side of it, I think we need to kind of look at it from the narcissist perspective, and then also from the perspective of the people who work with or work alongside or lead alongside someone who they think might have that trouble with the give and takes. what are some of the common behaviors, or what are some of the life history or the past that's common? Again, this is not necessarily every individual, but I'd love for you to be able to share a little bit about what is the background of someone who really is clinically a narcissist.
Yeah, I would say it tends to have a lot to do with there's typically a trauma history. They might be somebody that grew up in a highly dysfunctional home, maybe where there was like, abuse or neglect or maybe addiction. And in those severe circumstances, and stressful environments, they might start to lose trust and feel like they can only rely on themselves. And it's almost like when somebody grows up in a really dysfunctional or stressful environment, they're going to develop a strategy to navigate that. And it can get to a point where it's really, really difficult for them to, again, have trust or to see other person's perspectives because they're truly, you know, trying to figure out a way to get through. And then that doesn't necessarily equate to healthy relationships as an adult, in again, personally or professionally. And so, Roger, when you kind of describe, what does that really look like? It's almost like an individual who has their own perspective on something. And I think a lot of times, if it's true narcissism, they will do whatever it takes to accomplish their goals. And that might be, manipulative in nature. It also might be very, very intense in the sense of just like, there's no democracy, right? There's no teamwork necessarily. It's like, I'm going to tell you how this needs to go and everyone needs to follow suit.
Yeah. Yeah. Everyone needs to follow suit. That's a common thing that I think I hear from folks I work with, that their common complaint is they don't have a seat at the table. Even though they have a seat at the table, maybe from a organizational leadership perspective, they have a title, they have whatever, but the folks that their leader they're working with, they're like, hey, they don't allow me to play that role. So let's go down kind of two paths. One is let's understand the narcissist, and then I want to pivot and have a conversation for those who work with someone who has tendencies towards that. What are some of the things they do that cause them not to manage themselves very well in that relationship, and then what are some of the things that they can do to take some steps forward? So first of all, kind of understanding the behaviors, and you've explained this a little bit, but there's no democracy, there's no give and take. What other kind of behaviors do you see, or in leaders who have that? Because I know you have broad experience in that.
Sure. Another characteristic I would describe, Roger, is, and again, this could be someone that truly has a diagnosis in this area, like meaning a true mental health disorder, or someone that kind of fits into this category. Again, you can use this term loosely versus somebody who's really, really struggles with this, but there's very little interest or even self-awareness as to how they are perceived by others. So it might be one of these things where you have a leader that is really intense in the way that we're describing it. They're in the room. Everyone is, showing that person what they believe he wants to see or what she wants to see. The second that leader leaves the room, everyone, might be rolling their eyes or just like throwing their hands up in frustration. I got to say, Roger, seeing that myself professionally, like that's my biggest fear as a leader, is to have a team that thinks one thing of me, but nobody mentions it or I'm not aware of it. Like to me, that seems like the worst case scenario. But I think for a lot of leaders that kind of have more narcissistic tendencies, they're not tapped into or aware of how they're perceived by others. Some of the stuff we're talking about, like, either a tyrant or my way or the highway, or they're not truly considering other people's perspective. I also think leaders that have narcissistic tendencies, they don't tap into and utilize the strength and the expertise of the leaders around the table. If they have an executive team, they're kind of the smartest person in the room, and they don't really leverage the strength of the group, which is a real, I think, one of the major downfalls, quite honestly.
Yeah. So the self-awareness piece, which is an interesting piece, because I would argue that most people don't see themselves accurately. So self-awareness is something that everyone needs to struggle with. There's a particular I think difficulty for someone who has these tendencies, maybe this trauma, maybe this lack of ability to do a give and take. They're always the smartest person in the room. There's a little bit more of a block there. But one of the things that I would say gives us a little bit of compassion for that person is that, yeah, we struggle with that too. We don't see ourselves accurately either.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of a sense of like, how do you have compassion for a person in that situation? And then what allows someone, this would be interesting question for you to dive into is what allows someone to come to the place where they're willing and open to hear the perspective of the people around them.
Yeah. I think there's a practice that I wish all leadership teams leaned into, which is creating space to give each other feedback. And I think, it's been really a blessing to work on leadership teams in the mental health space because we like to practice what we preach, right? So, we don't just kind of get into the work, meaning like, the administrative and leadership stuff. Like we create space to talk about how we're feeling, how we're doing as a team, giving each other honest feedback. We build it into the structure. And so in my experience, if that's not part of the culture, especially with a leader that has more narcissistic tendencies, I think that the best way to kind of see if you can partner with that individual, again, being like healthy or dynamic, is to really lean into that. And you might not want to like do it in front of a group, like the team, but just pulling that person aside and just being honest about, hey, I'm having feelings about this. I don't know if you recognize this, but just kind of approaching with honesty in a way that hopefully, they might be able to hear and consider and shift. But, at least you can try to take that angle and try and be honest about it.
Yeah. Yeah, feedback is a big, I'd say, overused term, underutilized in its gifting in most organizations. Feedback's often feared, often unwelcome, often bad, poorly timed, all those things. I think the awareness, like what earns you the right to give someone feedback or for someone to give you feedback, is a big question, because I think a lot of people over rely on formal authority and not on earning the right or earning the relational capital to speak truth or welcome truth.
Sure.
So I want to talk a little bit more about self-awareness. And many people, but including Brene Brown, talk about how self-awareness is the key for leadership transformation. But just wondering your thoughts on how have you seen self-awareness be something that's cultivated? What tools have you used, have you found to be effective in working with leaders?
Yeah, because I've done some retreat style work with leadership teams, and I think when you can really get buy-in from the team as a whole, and maybe even the leader of that team, to kind of implement practices that support and nurture self-awareness, that can be really key. So, as much as we were talking earlier about, if you have a leader that doesn't seem to have a whole lot of self-awareness, nor is interested in it to like try and give that from the bottom up, I think when you have a leader that cultivates that and even leads by example, obviously leaders sometimes have directives and they have initiatives that they have to push forward in strategic planning, but it's like, how's everyone doing with it? What ideas do you have? I just love when leaders really create space and really want to elicit feedback, maybe about what they're doing as a team, but even one-on-one about, hey, how's my leadership style landing with you? What works, what doesn't? Is there anything that you feel uncomfortable, you're holding back? Quite honestly, Roger, and not everyone has to be a therapist to do this, but sometimes supervision, these kind of conversations, I mean, they kind of ride the line a little bit of like a level of honesty that you might in a therapeutic setting. It's like, this is how this makes me feel. These are my thoughts around this. Are you open to constructive feedback? But just really having a conversation that has some depth to it, because all of that matters. I think it really does. It
Yeah.
helps to get buy-in from your team when the team feels that you can, like, you truly care about where they're at, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. It gets buy-in in a way that you can't without that kind of culture.
Yeah, and my guess is that the healthiest leaders, the leader who buys into that, they're like, yeah, absolutely, like I want that. For the person with the blind spot, for the narcissist who is in that executive seat, who doesn't welcome that, not seeing that perspective. I don't know if this is speculation, but I want to spend a little bit of time on thinking about what is the fear, what's the block, what's the thing that keeps an executive from seeing that as an advantage, seeing that as a way of really providing leadership and leading the organization effectively. They clearly don't agree with that or don't see that. What are some of the things that you see as patterns that keep a leader from believing that?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great question, Roger, because I mean, if it's truly a personality disorder, I would say it's rooted in childhood. It's a maladaptive coping strategy, how they kind of present to the world. I mean, that to me is a very different thing than someone that just has more tendencies. But I think some leaders are looking more for operators and people to execute or push out their ideas and their plans. They don't look at it from, I'm going to pull from the strength and wisdom of all these people. They truly just think that they have a plan, they know best, and they need, you know, operators to just kind of push it out. And I guess maybe, that could come from past experiences where things didn't go well from a team approach, or they don't trust others. Because there's a definitely a control aspect in that. Like, it's like, if I control all the decisions, then things will go smoothly. To sort of really let others get involved in the leadership aspect they see as some sort of risk. And at the end of the day, probably don't trust the capability or the team that they're working with. There
Yeah.
has to be some trust issues there, I would think.
Yeah, I wonder also where there is some modeling of other leaders where I think, oh, a successful leader, an executive, this is the way they behave. So they're modeling something that they think is appropriate, even if it's not it's not clinical. It's just they say, oh, I'm the boss. I need to be the one with the ideas or whatever. The other one, I wonder if you think about this, is the idea of fear, like the fear of opening up to other people's perspective is the fear of, like, what if they think I am not the leader I'm supposed to be because
Yeah,
I'm
100%.
masking.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And you're absolutely right. Like, they might believe that not having all the answers is a sign of weakness or vulnerability, or others need them to be that. And again, you mentioned Brene Brown. I really appreciate her work because she highlights that vulnerability is so important. I mean, it's truly a strength. And there's power in the team, and there's power in connection. And I think the research shows it's a much more effective strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I connect that to one of my favorite books is the Gift of Being Yourself by David Benner. David talks about how we since we don't see ourselves accurately, we need to see ourselves through the eyes of the people who work with us, who love us and care for us, and which is such an uncommon approach, I think, to feedback. But there's that sense that I think leaders who lack self-awareness are trying to be good at everything. They're trying to be good at a broad spectrum of things and don't necessarily see the uniqueness that they bring to the table. And so they're overperforming. They're trying to take more responsibility rather than being interdependent with the other folks. And it's this idea of, like, you don't see yourself accurately. You're performing in ways that are actually counterproductive.
Yeah. I think the other part of what feels counterproductive in the scenario you just described, that type of leader, Roger, is it doesn't foster growth in the people on your team. They're not tasked to problem solve. I think sometimes teams under that type of leader or they're not motivated to really dig into their potential. I don't know. I just find that leaders like that, the teams underneath are not high functioning. And granted, I mean, I do think leaders like that might put a lot of pressure, and they could function that way. But in those scenarios, there tends to be a lot of high turnover.
Yeah. We could talk longer about the narcissist, but I want to pivot
Hmm.
to talk about the people who work with the narcissist.
Hmm.
Um, because I think that it's more common for the person who works with the narcissist to come and seek help than it is
Yeah.
for the narcissist to go, "Hey, I'm a narcissist. I need help." It's most of the time it's the people who go like, "Hey, I really am struggling with how to work in this environment." So about let's talk about an unhealthy response. What are some of the coping, or what are some of the things that you see, or that you would say about people who work with a narcissist that puts them in an unproductive stance? Because you're saying, hey, these teams are dysfunctional, maybe unproductive, there's high turnover. So what are those behaviors that you see that you would say, hey, let's pay attention to these behaviors for people not really being the leader they could be because they're being kind of shut down or allowing
Hmm.
themselves to be shut down by someone who maybe has that tendency?
Sure. I think people that are on those types of teams or have a boss or leader like that, they come to believe that the only thing they can do is agree and follow suit. They tend to lose their voice. They tend to allow their boundaries to be crossed. They tend to pretend that they're in on things, that they're okay with it. I would say most leaders that have narcissistic qualities, they tend to have a lot of people on their team that just shake their head yes when internally they're thinking no. And people can tolerate that kind of work environment for some time, but I definitely think it takes a major toll on them personally and professionally. They kind of get into this place where they believe they have to just pretend to be on board and pretend to be okay. And basically, it's just a lot of unhealthy relationship dynamics. They feel they need to tell their boss what they want to hear rather than what they're truly thinking and feeling. And quite honestly, that might be necessary to stay employed in that team. But that's where I think the high turnover comes into play, because some people can only tolerate that for so long, or they get burned out and they need to move on to something that hopefully is healthier.
Yeah. Yeah. I find it curious. A lot of the words you use there were a little bit more passive,
Hmm.
allowing,
Yes.
you know, and so there's a sense of the loss of agency, the loss of being willing to say, no, I have an opinion, I have a thought, I'm capable of thinking these things are not okay. But that loss of agency, would you say it comes from fear, or what are going to be the consequences if I speak up?
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah,
what you think?
I think so. And that fear could come in a couple different forms. Number one, they might maybe early on attempt to express their truth and their opinion, sharing their experience, the things that they know, and either directly or indirectly it gets shut down. And if you have that experience a couple of times, you're going to learn pretty quickly that, like, well, that's fruitless. Like, that's not helpful. The other thing I was thinking is, like, they might just kind of see it in the team. So you imagine someone joining this team, everyone presents as motivated and interested. The second the leader walks out, everyone's got a different energy. And so, trying to figure that out, they're like, okay, we have to act a certain way in front of this person, but then when they leave, everyone's talking this way. And so it's almost like when I described earlier how kids that are growing up in unhealthy environments develop a strategy on how to navigate it and survive it. I think that same concept rings true when it comes to teams and leadership. And I'd say a lot of people know what it's like to be in an unhealthy work environment. And I guess the question is, are you going to play the game, or are you going to try and, be true to yourself and shift it? Or do you have to go and find an environment, a work culture that is healthier for you?
Yeah, yeah. I've been playing around with this idea of waking up. I see a lot of folks who are in survival mode, and so they're in survival, and they don't necessarily see another option, or they don't allow themselves to see another option. They kind of go like, "Hey, I've got to be here. I don't have another place to go," and so that survival kicks in, and they kind of sleepwalk, and they dumb themselves down in a sense and stop being I would say being the leader they could be because they're in survival mode, and that's common whether you work with a narcissist or not. But I do think it's specifically for those folks as they're trying to go, hey, do I have to stay here? Do I need to stay here? This is really counterproductive, or it's sucking the life out of me, whatever. But don't have a strategy to move on. Thoughts about that?
No, I fully agree. And I think that that's common for people. I don't know if there's any work environments that are, 100% healthy or, great. And I do think it's, people have to weigh the pros and cons of certain environments, but definitely if it's really hard because of the dysfunction or just the unhealth of the work culture, I do understand it requires courage and believing that there's something different or better out there. But some people tolerate dysfunction better than others. I mean, again, the clinician in me, the mental health professional, thinks some people who grow up in dysfunctional homes they feel quite at home in a dysfunctional organization.
Yeah.
It's what they know, and it's what, um, quite honestly, they're comfortable with, even though it's not healthy, but they can tolerate it.
Yeah, I've thinking about family systems. There's a great book called "Failure of Nerve," which is about kind of how family systems translate into human organizations. I found it fascinating because I'm not, a clinical. I don't have that background, and so having some insight about how organizations function and how people are comfortable in dysfunction is a fascinating. It's a fascinating thing to me how they cross
Yeah.
over.
Yeah.
So I think you and I both come to a perspective if we have some compassion. We're dealing with humans who are real people. And so when we think about like what can we encourage, this isn't like kind of a doom and gloom kind of thing of like you just accept.
No.
So what are some of the things that strategies or some of the things that we can offer to folks to say, hey, let's regain some agency.
Yes.
Let's try some things. What have you found to be helpful? Obviously, leaving and going is one thing, but you still take who you are to that. So if you tolerated something here, you're going to stay
Exactly.
there. So, what are some of the strategies that you think that you've seen your clients use, or you've encouraged people to do that makes it more effective?
No, I love that question because I do agree with you. The answer is not always to leave, and wherever you go, there you are, as far as like moving from organization to organization. I think what I would encourage folks is seek some coaching, seek some support, seek some therapy, because sometimes these struggles are related more to like who you are and what you've been through than maybe even the organization itself. And so I think sometimes people don't feel that they can be honest with their supervisor, the leaders within the company. And I strongly encourage people to speak up and to be more honest and trust the way that plays out. And I also am a fan of coaching people on how to express themselves in a way that tends to be unarguable. You can say what you need to say, but how you say it is super important. So, if somebody kind of goes into their boss's office and says, you're doing all these things wrong and it's not fair, that's not going to land as well as if they said, hey, I'm having some struggles. And from my perspective, or this is how I feel. If you can take some ownership in your feedback, I think it lands with people better. And there's an art to expressing what you're thinking and feeling and what you need, and it can land better than others. So getting some coaching or support around how to do that can be really helpful. Maybe even rehearsing with some people that you trust, but ultimately staying quiet and just tolerating obviously doesn't work really well. And sometimes you'll be surprised by how receptive the people are. I learned something. I was on a team for a long time. My first role as a leader was within a world-class addiction treatment center, and I kind of noticed that different people had different boundaries, and the organization would let you work yourself way too much, but they would also respect if you set boundaries and had a decent personal and professional balance. And what the key factor in that was, what was the person willing to tolerate? And also, would they speak up and set those boundaries? So I really do believe that we do have agency and that we do need to lean into this and speak up for ourselves, speak up for the health of the culture and the organization, and make an impact in that way. You might not just make your situation better, but it could have a positive impact on the entire system, which is
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually was just having a conversation with a client today, and the conversation was about how do you this hard conversation with someone, and the instinct was to go in and to kind of directly address the issue. uh, and so we had a conversation about how effective is that usually, and how much more effective might it be if you go, hey, here's my perspective about this. Now I can take agency to say what I need or what I want, but sometimes I find that it's about the lack of clarity in terms of being able to say, hey, here's the expectation, and here's where, hey, you've asked me to do this, but I also noticed this. Those two things seem to be in contrast. Can you help me better
Yes.
understand your expectations, because I want to work well with you. I want to be your your partner, and can you help me with that? Is a way of kind of having a conversation about your needs that kind of speak to the inconsistency or the lack of, here's what you said you want me to do, but here's how I'm being treated. So I
Yeah.
really like that idea of like setting up the conversation where it's not a attack, but it's a coming to it with a personal vulnerability.
Yeah.
What what other thoughts? What other thoughts about how should a leader address picking up of agency after they've not exhibited that?
Yeah. No, first of all, Roger, I love I love what you just said, because there's a lot of ways messages can come across from a leader, and it's like they're saying one thing and they're doing another, or they're saying this but it feels like this. And I think that would be a great strategy. Be like, hey, this feels a bit confusing. I'm not clear. I need to kind of talk it through and better understand. I think that looking for clarity and really just getting clear whether it's about what are the expectations of me, or what are you really really trying to communicate, because it feels clunky and unclear. I love that. The other thing I would encourage, and this might seem small or silly, but I'm a big fan of what I like to call the conversation before the conversation. If you were my boss and we're busy trying to execute this plan or run this company, I might say to you, Roger, hey, I'm struggling and I need to have a hard conversation with you. Do you have time for that now? Can we schedule time a little bit later? Because I think sometimes when you just kind of jump into a conversation, if the person, your boss or whoever it is, isn't in a place to really have that conversation, that could work against you in so many ways. And because I've had multiple experiences with that where it's like, no, now's not a good time. Actually, is there anybody else that needs to be in this conversation? Can we wait until we wrap up things in the first quarter before we have that? But when both people are in a good space with enough time and a good mindset, the conversations can go much more productively.
Hmm. Yeah. That's good wisdom of not jumping in kind of spur of the moment, but preparing someone for a conversation
That's right.
is respectful, and it
Hmm.
honors them. That's
Yeah.
I think that's good. I think in my experience, the the lack of clarity, or the willingness to live without clarity,
Hmm.
is one of those things I think that sabotages most leaders, or most people who are working with, in a leadership team, making assumptions, not clarifying expectations, not clarifying the things that the agreements you have with each other. So I think there's a tendency when we're working with strong personalities to do that more and more, to kind of assume a lot of stuff, threatened, and then not really act like the leader that we're hired to be, the role we're hired to play. And I want to tie that into the idea that we can get into that situation because we really don't see ourselves acting in that way. And so, um, I've had experiences in my life where I've worked, in a sense, opened my eyes after a period of time and gone, oh my goodness, I'm at a place I didn't think I would be. And it usually happens because of a good piece of insight or feedback that comes from outside of my my perspective, and the idea that we don't see ourselves accurate. We need other people to kind of feed into our self perception. So again, coming back to the idea of how do we help, how does this conversation benefit people who are working with a narcissist is if someone was going to take an inventory and go like, hey, here's some things I need to think about on a regular basis, or what is some of those recommendations on what those questions should look like to be more self-aware.
No, I love that. Yeah, it's interesting because leaders need to lead, and hopefully their expertise, their wisdom, maybe other key factors kind of put them in that position. But I think, do I know where my team's at truly? How am I doing between asking them to be operators, but also eliciting their, feedback? Because I know for me, it's like, gosh, I'm perfectly fine filling my team or just being around people that are smarter than me in other ways. And I need that. My ego can handle it. I love it because it's like that creates a really robust team. So I think it's important for leaders to make sure they have a solid understanding, a realistic understanding of how they're being perceived by their team. Are they eliciting feedback? Are they capitalizing on the strengths and expertise of their team members? I think that's a really big one. And are they truly in a place where their team can give them honest feedback? I mean, that's even a great question. I mean, imagine sitting down, if you were the leader of a team, you had 8 people in your executive team. How honest do you feel you can be with me?
Yeah.
Like, truly, on a scale from 1 to 10, how honest can you be? And if they say, a 5, it's like, well, what keeps you from feeling like you can be honest with me? I mean, those are amazing conversations because it's a ton of benefit to me because I get a better sense of what my blind spots are.
Yeah. I think the discipline of regularly asking those questions. So I'd say one behavior then is regularly going to the people that work for you or work around you and having a conversation about, hey, tell me something I don't know. Tell me something I need to know.
Yes.
Tell me some things that you think I may not know about myself that would really help me be better.
Yeah.
And allowing them to take that. So if a leader's not doing that, I would say that's one thing that you recommend. Hey, go and have those conversations and do that right.
You can do it formally or informally. I mean, I've worked in organizations where we made that a part of, annual review process. I mean, that's not frequent enough, in my opinion. I definitely might do it quarterly with key people. And, the other thing, Roger, it's like, have it infiltrate the organizations. You have the leader and the leadership team, it happens there, but then the leadership team can do a similar process with their team. And I think an organization that has some of the boots on the ground in the trenches, like those people know things and have the details that the top leadership need to know about day-to-day operations and what's happening, but also just creating a culture where constructive feedback is truly welcomed. I mean, that's really key.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. The tendency I see a lot in organizations is we want to have a either feedback culture or a leadership culture or whatever, but we want to start with people at the lower parts of the organization. I want them to be comfortable with it without coming from people, the humility of people in the executive seats also doing that. So my encouragement always is you've got to start, you got to exhibit that at the top of the organization, or if you want to put it upside organization, you got to do it at the foundational piece, which is the executives, and allow that to flow up to the rest of the organization. But it is hard. It is a discipline. It has to be. It's not something that people get naturally. And one of the things that I think is true about executives is executives get the least amount of feedback of people in the organization because of the positional authority, the busyness, the lack of people in authority being in the same room with them. So that idea of actually going and seeking and giving the space for that is a very simple thing, hard thing, but a very simple thing. And I would say, like, if you're doing that, then you're most likely going to identify the behaviors that a narcissist might exhibit. And I do think there's the idea of the agency, of taking agency over the feedback you get.
Yeah. Yeah. Roger, an organization that does not have that structure in place in any way, shape, or form, even if the leadership is not narcissistic or even has those tendencies, I still get nervous about, frontline staff or people that, again, are several removed, just feeling like the leadership is out of touch. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what we're dealing with. Like, it can create a culture that just not healthy, and it affects obviously the product or the service in a deep way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
A lot more we could talk about, I'm sure, but this has been great, and appreciate, Christopher, your willingness to jump on here and have this conversation. And we'll have to think about some other topics that we can jump on and talk about. But thanks. And I wish you all the best. Congratulations on starting your practice.
Thank you.
Remedy Counseling and Wellness in Franklin, Tennessee.
Yes.
So thank you, Christopher. Blessings on you and all your work.
Thank you so much, Roger. Appreciate you having me.
Thanks for listening to No More Carbon Copies. If today's episode challenged your thinking or sparked a new idea, we'd love for you to share it or leave a review. And if you want to go deeper, take the free Leadership Blind Spots Diagnostic. It's a quick tool that helps you identify the hidden patterns holding you back and gives you practical insight to grow your leadership and your team. Just head to viveroleadership.com/diagnostic or use the QR code on the screen to take it now. We'll see you next time. Until then, lead true.